Nigel Farage has never been silenced. For over 20 years, he's been the voice of British Euroscepticism, the man who sold Brexit to 17 million people, the political operator who always had an answer, always controlled the narrative, always walked away from interviews having said exactly what he wanted to say. Until February 2024, when he invited Conor McGregor onto his GB News primetime show to discuss immigration, national identity, and what it means to represent your country. What Conor said to him, calmly and surgically, made Nigel Farage sit in complete silence for 18 seconds before attempting a response that everyone watching knew was hollow. This is the story of how a fighter from Dublin walked into the lion's den of British populism and dismantled its most famous architect, live on television using nothing but historical facts and uncomfortable truths. To understand why this interview shattered British political media, you need to know three things. First, Nigel Farage, 70 years old, is arguably the most consequential British politician of the 21st century, despite never winning a seat in Parliament. He led UKIP from obscurity to a force that terrified the Conservative Party into calling the Brexit referendum. When Leave won in 2016, it was Farage's face on the front pages, Farage's rhetoric that had convinced millions of working-class voters that the European Union was destroying Britain. Since then, he built a lucrative career as a broadcaster, first on LBC Radio, now hosting his own show on GB News, the upstart channel that positioned itself as Britain's answer to Fox News. His show, Farage, drew over 200,000 viewers nightly, massive numbers for GB News, and his interview style was confrontational, populist, designed to make guests defensive while he played the common-sense everyman. Second, the invitation to Conor McGregor seemed strategic. Farage wanted to discuss immigration through the lens of someone who'd made it as an immigrant success story. The producers thought Conor, as an Irishman who'd built global success, would be a softball guest who'd talk about legal immigration and hard work. They had no idea that Conor had been watching Farage for years, that he'd studied Brexit's impact on Ireland, particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that he was walking into that studio with very specific things he wanted to say. Third, the timing mattered. This was February 2024, over 7 years after Brexit, and the promised benefits still hadn't materialised. Food prices were up 30%, energy costs had doubled, the NHS was collapsing, and Farage, who'd promised that leaving the EU would solve everything, had moved on to new targets: immigration, woke culture, anything to distract from the fact that Brexit had failed to deliver. But that night, sitting across from a man who had no political career to protect and no reason to play nice, Farage was about to be held accountable in a way British journalists had failed to do for 2 decades. The GB News studio was designed to feel intimate, almost pub-like, which suited Farage's brand perfectly. 2 leather chairs, a small table between them with Farage's trademark pint of beer, warm lighting that made everything feel conversational rather than confrontational. Farage sat with his legs crossed, that famous smile already in place, completely confident. Conor wore a tailored charcoal suit, no tie, white shirt open at the collar. His posture was relaxed but alert, the way a fighter sits in the corner before the bell rings. Farage opened with his usual charm offensive. "Conor, great to have you here. You're someone who represents, in many ways, the immigrant success story. You came from nothing in Dublin, worked hard, made yourself into a global phenomenon. That's the kind of immigration story people can get behind, isn't it? Legal, productive, someone who contributes." The trap was obvious to anyone paying attention. Farage wanted Conor to agree, to distance himself from bad immigrants, to validate Farage's narrative that there were good and bad kinds of foreigners. Conor smiled slightly, recognising the setup. "That's an interesting way to frame it, Nigel. Interesting because it assumes my success makes me more legitimate than someone who didn't achieve the same level of fame or wealth. But let me ask you something before we go further. When you look at me, do you see an Irish immigrant who succeeded, or do you see an example you can use to criticize other immigrants who didn't? Farage's smile tightened just slightly, the first crack. I see someone who played by the rules and made something of themselves, that's all I'm saying. Right, Conor nodded. The rules. Let's talk about those rules, Nigel, because I'm very interested in who gets to make them and who benefits from them.
Farage tried to steer toward his prepared talking points about controlled borders and cultural cohesion, but Conor cut him off politely but firmly. Before we talk about modern immigration, let's talk about historical context. You're okay with that? Farage, caught slightly off guard, nodded. Of course. Good, Conor said, because I come from a country that has a very particular relationship with immigration and with Britain. For 800 years, Ireland was colonised by Britain. Our language was banned, our land was stolen, our people were starved. During the Great Famine in the 1840s, Ireland's population dropped by 25%. 1 million people died. Another million emigrated, most of them to Britain, America, Australia. Farage shifted in his seat. I'm aware of the history. Are you? Conor's tone sharpened. Because when those Irish immigrants arrived in Britain, they weren't welcomed. They were treated like animals. There were signs in windows, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. They were accused of taking jobs, of bringing disease, of not integrating. The exact same language you use today about Syrian refugees or Albanian asylum seekers. The studio had gone very quiet. Farage's producer, visible through the glass of the control room, leaned forward. Farage himself tried to interrupt. That's not a fair comparison. Conor raised his hand. I'm not finished. Those Irish immigrants, the ones who were called criminals and drunks and a threat to British culture, they built your railroads, they worked in your factories, they fought in your wars, and their children and grandchildren became doctors, teachers, business owners, politicians. They became British, just like every wave of immigrants before and since. The pattern is always the same, Nigel. New group arrives, people like you say they're destroying the country, a generation later they're part of the fabric, and you've moved on to fear-mongering about the next group. Farage's face had reddened slightly. I'm not fear-mongering, I'm raising legitimate concerns about... About what? Conor interrupted. About brown and black people? Because let's be honest, when Polish people came after EU expansion, you complained about them too. Eastern Europeans, white, Christian, European, and you still said they were taking jobs and ruining communities. So it's not about culture or religion or integration, it's about othering anyone who's different to distract from the real problems. Farage pivoted. Brexit wasn't about immigration alone. It was about sovereignty, about Britain controlling its own destiny. Conor laughed, short and sharp. Controlling its own destiny. How's that working out, Nigel? 7 years since the referendum. Let's talk about the promises you made. You said leaving the EU would save £350 million a week for the NHS. That was a lie and you knew it. You said there'd be no economic damage. Britain's economy has underperformed every other G7 country since Brexit. You said trade would be easier. There are now customs checks and delays that have crippled small businesses. You said everything would be better, and it's objectively worse. Farage's jaw tightened. The benefits take time. They always said that. How much time, Nigel? Conor leaned forward now, his intensity increasing. 5 years? 10? 20? At what point do the people who believed you get to say, you lied to us? At what point do you take responsibility? I take responsibility for fighting for what I believed in, Farage said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Conor shook his head. No, you take credit when things go well and blame everyone else when they don't. When Brexit passed, you were on television celebrating, calling it Independence Day. But when the consequences hit, when prices went up, when supply chains broke, when the Northern Ireland Protocol created chaos, you said it wasn't real Brexit, that politicians had sabotaged it. You can't have it both ways. Either you own Brexit and its failures, or you admit you sold people a fantasy. The silence in the studio was absolute. Farage's trademark smirk was completely gone. "And let me tell you what hurts the most," Conor continued, his Dublin accent thick with emotion. "You sold Brexit hardest to the people who could afford it least. Working-class communities in the north, in Wales, people who were struggling and angry and looking for answers. You told them their problems were caused by immigrants and bureaucrats in Brussels, but their problems were caused by decades of underinvestment, by the destruction of manufacturing, by a political class that abandoned them, and you knew that, but you gave them a scapegoat instead of a solution, because scapegoats are easier to sell."
Farage tried to regain control by going personal. "That's very easy for you to say, Conor. You're worth hundreds of millions. You live in mansions. You fly private. What do you know about working-class struggles?" Conor's eyes flashed. "What do I know? Let me tell you what I know, Nigel. I know what it's like to be 23 years old, living in a freezing flat in Dublin on welfare, eating one meal a day, training full-time with no sponsors, no support, no guarantee it would ever work out. I know what it's like to have no connections, no safety net, nothing but my own belief that I could make something of myself. And you? What do you know about working-class struggles?" Farage opened his mouth, but Conor kept going. "You went to Dulwich College, a private school. Your father was a stockbroker. You worked in the city as a commodities trader. You've spent the last 20 years as an MEP, drawing a salary from the EU, and now you're a highly paid broadcaster. You've never missed a meal, never worried about rent, never had to choose between heating and eating. You're as establishment as it gets. You just wear a Barber jacket and drink pints in pubs to pretend you're one of the people." The attack was surgical. Farage's carefully cultivated man-of-the-people image was being shredded in real time. "But I've fought for working-class people my entire career," Farage protested weakly. "No," Conor said flatly. "You've used working-class people to build your career. You've exploited their pain, their anger, their fear. You've given them enemies to hate instead of solutions to help them. And when Brexit failed to improve their lives, you didn't apologize. You didn't admit you were wrong. You just found new enemies for them to blame. Immigrants, woke activists, climate protesters, anyone but the people actually responsible for their suffering." Farage tried once more to shift the conversation. "Look, we can disagree about Brexit's implementation, but the principle of national sovereignty. How's that sovereignty working for Northern Ireland?" Conor interrupted. "Because Brexit created a border in the Irish Sea. It separated Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK economically. It destabilized the Good Friday Agreement. It reignited tensions that had been settled for 20 years. Your Brexit put peace in Ireland at risk, and you didn't care because it wasn't your problem." Farage's face showed genuine discomfort now. "The Northern Ireland Protocol was badly handled, I agree, but nothing," Conor cut him off. "You sold Brexit without thinking through the consequences for Ireland. Or maybe you did think it through and just didn't care because Irish peace was less important than English sovereignty. Either way, you created a problem that Irish people are now dealing with while you sit here in your comfortable studio talking about taking back control." Farage had no good answer. The Northern Ireland issue had always been Brexit's most obvious flaw, the contradiction that couldn't be resolved. You can't have no border between Ireland and Northern Ireland and also have Brexit without creating a border somewhere. And that border, whether in the Irish Sea or on the island, threatened peace. "It's being worked on," Farage said weakly. "By who?" Conor challenged. "By the politicians you spent 20 years calling traitors and saboteurs? By the EU you said was an evil empire? Funny how now that there's an actual problem to solve, you're nowhere to be found. You lit the fire, Nigel, but you're not helping put it out. You're just looking for the next fire to start." The conversation had shifted completely from what Farage had planned. He was no longer in control, no longer steering, just reacting, trying desperately to land a punch. "You talk about sacrifice," Nigel said, "but you're the one who switched from MMA to boxing for a payday. You're the one who promoted whiskey and suits. You're as much a brand as a fighter." "True," Conor agreed immediately. "I've built a business around myself. I've made a lot of money, but I've never pretended to be anything I'm not. I've never sold myself as a man of the people while living like aristocracy. I came from nothing, and I'm honest about wanting success. You came from privilege, and you pretend to be working class. That's the difference." "I am working class," Farage insisted. "Your father was a stockbroker," Conor repeated. "You went to private school. You worked in finance. Nothing about your life has been working class since you were born. But you've spent 30 years performing working class identity because it's politically useful. You drink pints, you smoke cigarettes, you talk about cricket and real England. It's all performance. And the working class people you claim to represent see through it. They just don't have a platform to call you out. Well, I do, and I'm doing it now." Farage looked genuinely rattled. His usual composure, the smirk, the confidence, all of it was gone. He looked like a man who'd been expecting a friendly chat and walked into an ambush. "But here's what really bothers me," Conor said, his voice quieter now but more intense. "You had a chance to actually help people. After Brexit won, you had political capital. You could have pushed for investment in the communities that voted leave. You could have demanded better healthcare, better schools, better infrastructure. You could have held the government accountable for delivering on the promises you made. But you didn't. You declared victory and moved on to the next grievance, the next enemy, the next thing to be angry about. Because actually solving problems doesn't serve you. Keeping people angry does." There was a long silence. Farage stared at Conor, his face a mix of emotions difficult to read. Anger, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked like recognition. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was different, quieter, less performative. "You think you have me all figured out, don't you?" "I think I understand what you are," Conor said calmly. "You're a salesman, a very good one. You sold Brexit to people who were desperate for change, and you did it by telling them simple stories about complex problems. But the product you sold doesn't work, and instead of admitting that, you're trying to sell them something else." Farage looked down at his pint, untouched throughout the interview, his signature prop, part of his everyman costume, and he hadn't even performed with it. When he looked back up, something had shifted in his expression. "You know what the worst part is," he said quietly. "What? You're right. Not about everything. I still believe in Brexit. I still think the EU was bad for Britain. But you're right that I've moved on while other people are living with the consequences. You're right that I've built a career on keeping people angry rather than helping them solve problems. And you're right that I come from privilege and I've performed working class identity because it's useful." The admission was stunning. The host, who'd been silent for nearly 10 minutes, looked shocked. The producers in the control room were frozen. Conor didn't gloat, he just nodded. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do?" Farage asked, and for the first time he sounded genuinely lost. "I'm 70 years old. This is who I am. This is what I've built." "You can tell the truth," Conor said simply. "You can stop fear-mongering. You can stop giving people enemies and start helping them find solutions. You can use your platform for something other than division." Farage smiled sadly. "That doesn't get ratings." "Then maybe ratings aren't what matters," Conor replied. The interview ended there, but the impact was seismic. Within an hour, Farage McGregor was trending #1 on Twitter in the UK. Clips of the interview had been viewed millions of times. British newspapers scrambled to cover it. The Guardian's headline read, "McGregor dismantles Farage's career in real time." The Telegraph, usually sympathetic to Farage, admitted uncomfortable viewing for Brexit architect. Even the Daily Mail acknowledged that Farage had been outmatched. The response across social media was overwhelming.
Many of Farage's traditional supporters were furious, calling Conor ignorant, saying he had no right to comment on British politics, demanding he stay in his lane. But others, including some who'd voted for Brexit, found themselves agreeing with Conor's criticisms. One viral tweet from a Leave voter read, "I voted Brexit because Farage promised things would get better. They didn't. McGregor's right. We were sold a lie and nobody's been held accountable." In Ireland, the reaction was triumphant. Conor had articulated what many Irish people felt about Brexit, that it was reckless, that it threatened Irish peace, that it was built on lies and nostalgia and imperial arrogance. Irish social media celebrated the interview as a cultural moment, an Irishman holding British power to account on British television. Farage himself tried to recover. He posted on social media that he'd had a robust discussion with McGregor and that he respected people who speak their mind. But the spin didn't work. The interview had been too raw, too honest, too revealing. For the first time in his career, Farage had been genuinely rattled, and millions of people had watched it happen. What happened between Conor McGregor and Nigel Farage on GB News in February 2024 wasn't just a confrontation between an athlete and a politician. It was a moment of accountability that British political media had failed to provide for 20 years. Farage had built his career on never being cornered, on always having an answer, on controlling the narrative. But Conor didn't play by those rules. He didn't care about seeming balanced or fair or politically neutral. He cared about truth. And the truth was simple. Farage had sold Brexit by exploiting people's pain, and when Brexit failed to deliver, he moved on to new targets without taking responsibility. That's not politics. That's grift. The interview proved something important, that media training and political experience don't matter when you're facing someone who has no political career to protect, no desire to be invited back, no reason to pull punches. Conor walked into that studio with nothing to lose and everything to say. And in doing so, he asked the questions British journalists should have been asking for years. Where are Brexit's benefits? Why haven't things gotten better? When will you take responsibility? The answers, or lack thereof, spoke for themselves. Farage's moment of honesty, his admission that Conor was right about some things, was perhaps the most significant part. It suggested that even he, the master salesman, the architect of Brexit, knew that the project had failed. He just couldn't afford to admit it publicly because his entire brand depended on never backing down, never admitting error, never showing weakness. But faced with someone who didn't care about his brand, he cracked. Just for a moment, just enough. What Conor McGregor did that night was remind Britain that accountability matters, that politicians shouldn't be allowed to destroy things and walk away, that questions deserve answers and promises deserve to be kept. He didn't do it with political sophistication or diplomatic language. He did it with directness, with historical knowledge, with moral clarity. And millions of people, in Britain and beyond, watched and realized that maybe the emperor really had no clothes. Maybe the man who'd sold them Brexit really was just a salesman in a barber jacket, performing working-class identity while living in privilege, keeping people angry because anger was profitable. The interview changed nothing and everything. Brexit didn't get reversed, Farage didn't retire, but something shifted in the British conversation. A seed of doubt was planted, and sometimes that's all it takes.